Hey, so today we're going to go through the process of dressing our looms. So I'll walk you through what calculating your warp means. We'll be using the warp board to measure the yarn that we'll be using for our project. We will be tying that warp onto the breast beams. That's what you might see a lot of these looms in here are doing right now. We'll be tying our beater up to immobilize it, and that will assist us in slaying the reed and threading our heddles. And then finally, we'll be releasing that beater to give us more tension, and that'll allow us to tie onto the back rod so it'll go over the back beam. And then we'll be able to beam our warp through the heddles and the beater through our reed. And finally, we'll be able to tie on to the front rod for tension. And then we'll be ready to start weaving, and we'll start by weaving a header, and that gives us space to start our real project. So here's a starter project we're going to be working on. We're actually going to be working on 2 scarves with 1 tie-up. So we'll be starting with a really basic, simple plain weave. That's what this looks like. It's where our yarn just goes over and under. You lift treadles 1 and 3, or shafts 1 and 3, and then 2 and 4, over and over again to create these patterns. And then we'll also be doing, with the same tie-up, we'll be doing a twill. So this is like a houndstooth twill, and that is a little bit more of a complicated treadling, but it's still very simple. It'll be shafts 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, 3 and 4, and 1 and 4. But we'll have more about that later. So with this in mind, that these are the projects that we'll be doing, I wanted to do a breakdown of why we're measuring out the yarn that we're measuring out. So for this scarf, with the width that it is, we end up having 96 ends, okay? 96 ends, that's for both colors. So if we divide 96 by 2, that gives us 48. So that means we have 48 ends for each color that we're working with, okay? And so we're going to be working in 12 groups of 4. That's what this looks like, 12 groups of 4. This is 4 for each stripe. So basically, all that means is as we're beginning to start warping our yarn, we need to make sure that we do 48 ends for each color. So the first step to weaving after you've decided what your project is going to look like is actually to calculate our warp needs. And a warp is the long length of our string. It's the length of our project plus some, but it's the long string. So in order to be able to weave effectively, we need to know how much yarn we're actually going to be using. So to calculate our warp, we need to know the dimensions of our project. So we need to know how long it is that we're actually working on. So for our sample project, we're going to be doing 2 scarves, okay? And we're going to do 2 scarves. Each scarf will be 2 yards long, okay? And from there, we need to be able to calculate how much space is taken up with our fringe. Our fringe is the end pieces of our scarves. And so I've actually calculated the fringe in with the length. So for example, let's actually say that each scarf is approximately 1.5 yards, and then we still have that half of a yard that we can use as flexibility for fringe on both ends of the scarf. So 2 yards for the scarf length plus the fringe. Okay, we also have to add our loom waist, and loom waist is the parts of the warp that you can't actually use. So we have loom waist all the time. That'll be happening at the very end whenever you are tying on those areas where the knotting is. That'll happen because we can't weave things that are thread through our heddles and things. It just doesn't reach. And then you'll also have loom waist on the opposite end on the front of your loom, again where the knots are. So every loom is different. For all intents and purposes for this project, working with beginning weavers, I like to give a little wiggle room. So I'm going to add 1 full yard of loom waist to our calculating warp needs. And finally, I think it's really wise for any beginner weaver or any weaver in general to allot room to test your patterns and figure out if you like the way that your treadling is working and the way that you're making your pattern look. So I always add a little extra length for practicing. So I'm gonna add an extra yard to the end of that. So in total, if we're weaving 2 scarves, one will be plain weave and one will be a twill houndstooth weave. We have 2 scarves times 2 yards each, so that's 4 yards there. Plus we have our 1 yard for loom waist, plus 1 yard for practice space. So that gives us 6 yards for our warp totals. And from there, we're going to move on to the warping board and actually measure out our 6 yards. All right, now we're going to be warping our yarn. This is a warping board. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. This is one that I'm working with just because it's nice and head height. It gives me a lot of motion and movement, nice and simple. So every warping board is different. The ones that we have in our studio are approximately 1 yard wide. That makes it really easy for measuring our projects. So the project we're working on now is going to be 6 yards total. So that means we're actually going to have 6 layers in our warp measurements. So what's really important about warping at this step is maintaining our cross. We'll be doing that here. I'll show you how in just a minute. But it's really important because the cross is what keeps all of our thread in order, keeps everything in line, and it makes the chaos a little lesser as we start going through everything. I'm gonna start with my yellow yarn. I've chosen 2 colors, but I'm gonna start with yellow, and I'm going to start warping 48 ends for our first project. And we're going to be doing 6 yards total. So I'm just going to park my yarn here on one of the pegs, and I'm going to tie just a simple knot on the end on this first peg, just to keep my thread in place. It doesn't really matter because we'll end up cutting this off anyway. This is just part of the loom waist. Okay, and make sure it's secure. Okay, so first thing is first. So we want to create our cross. So to do that, we're going to go up and over this first peg, and then we'll go under the second peg, and then we'll go around, bring this around this way, around again. Now we're on yard 3. Okay, yard 4, and then yard 5. The yarn is fallen, and then we reach 6. We reach the end. And once you get to the end of your project length on a warping board, you're actually going to start by going under this last peg, and then pull it up, and then you'll be on top of it now, and then you'll start over. So you'll go again, keeping it going, we're following, just like that. Okay. And then once we get back to our top, we're making that cross now. So we're actually going to reverse what we did before. So we'll go over this first peg and under the second one. And if you think about it, it's still the same idea. We're going over first, under second. It's just reversed. Okay, and then we'll come back and we'll do the same thing like we did below, where we're going under, and then we'll go under and over on top of this first peg, okay? And then we're gonna start again, where we were going over that first peg, under that second peg, and then we're just gonna keep following. And we're gonna do that until we get to number 48. And it's good to keep track of how much you're going, how many ends you have at a time. So what I like to do is once I get to say like 10 ends, then I'll actually count those 10 ends and then keep them bunched together on my ends here, on my pegs here, just so I can keep track of what I'm doing. I don't have to count them all at the end. Note that if you use this very, very last peg, you'll actually have half the number of ends, just because this is our end, so it's our end loop. It's a loop instead of being a single piece of string. So I'm gonna keep doing this. I'll get my 48 ends, and then we'll learn how to tie it up and then start on our next color. Okay, so I have reached the end. I have my 48 ends for this first color. So now I'm going to tie off. I'm going to do a knot just like with the first. Again, this is loom waist, so it doesn't really matter that much as long as everything is secure. So just tying my knot. Okay, so tying my knot, and now I'll show you the places that you need to actually tie off to secure your yarn before we move it off the warping board and onto the looms. Okay, what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to have approximately 12 pieces of a different color yarn, a different color string, that are about a foot long, and I'm just gonna tear those off really quickly. Those will be our tie-off points, and I'll show you exactly where to tie off. But you'll notice something that's really nice. You know that you've warped it, or that you've that you've warped it correctly, because there's a cross here. There's a really nice cross. There's no strings that are different. You'll notice it's different if you see a line up here. You're like, oh no, so then you just have to go in and fix it, and it's not a big deal. Depending on where it is, there might be some more wiggle room you have to do, but it's a very easy fix. Okay, so now I'm going to take the 12 pieces that I tore off that are about a foot long, and I'll show you all the tying off places that you want to make. And we're making these tying off places so that we can keep our string together as we start to dress our loom. So the most important part of warping our yarn here is the cross. This cross is essential. Again, it's what keeps everything in order. It makes our lives much easier as we start going in to actually slay our reed and thread the heddles. So we want to make sure that this cross is secured as we move on to our next steps. So what I like to do is find my cross here, and I actually thread yarn through both sides just so I have that definition there. And I make a knot here. I tie mine in bows just because they're easier to get off that way, but we want something that definitely marks off our cross. So then our next step, the next place we want to tie is our four corners here to keep the cross separate. So we want to tie one down here. Okay, and again, I like to use bows just so they can come out when I want them to, but they're still in there. And then we'll do one up here. And then we'll do on the opposite side. Same thing, one on top and one on bottom. Make sure you're getting those strings nice and tight against each other just so there's not a lot of slippage. Okay, one more. Okay, and then from there, I like to just choose points that will ensure a nice clean removal from this warping board. So I'm going to place one here at this very first turning peg, and then I'll just choose some going on along the way, leaving a little bit of space at the very end here, and I'll show you why. Depending on how you've used the warping board, you might have a cross here, you might have a cross here as well. This is the only cross that matters. We will ignore those crosses. They don't do us harm, but they're not essential. So now then, we're going to want to slide off this last peg, our loop here at the end. We want to slowly bring it off. It's going to release a lot of tension. Yeah, so then we see our strings start to relax. They'll start to droop a little bit. That's totally fine. So what we want to do is we want to do an overhand knot right here like that, just so we can maintain this loop at the end. This knot helps our string maintain an end. They stay at this end. That's really important as we move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and take that one off. So now I'm going to put my right hand in this loop that I created because I'm right-handed, and I'll take my left hand and I'll just use this to guide the string. Now I'm going to be making, basically, if you're familiar with crochet, a chain. So I'm going to take my right hand, grab the string in front of me, and then pull it through this loop, holding onto it. So then I have this string now, it's creating a new loop. So then I can do the same thing, pulling through again, and we'll do it all the way through. So we'll stop our chain once we reach the area where our cross goes, and then we can just remove it. These end knots are sometimes a little difficult to get off, but they're fine. But we'll just pull it off, and then we'll bring it to our loom so we can get started with tying onto the breast beam and securing our beater, and then actually starting to slay our reed and thread the heddles. And firstly, before I do that, I'm going to go through and beam my other color of yarn with 48 ends as well. Okay, we're almost done now. The last thing we're going to be doing today before we start working on slaying the reed, threading the heddles, and doing all the other good stuff is we're just going to prepare our warp to go onto the loom. So we'll be tying this warp onto our breast beam right here, and that just helps ensure that everything is tight and we're able to access all of the things like the beater and the shafts. So firstly, pick whatever color you want to start with. Really does not matter at all. I'm going to start with my darker color this time, and you want to choose the end that has your cross. The cross, remember, that we tied off in the center and then the 4 little legs. Okay, so this is my cross end. It's also the opposite end to where your chain is. So we'll take this, and what we want to do is we want to measure. We want to give us distance between the shafts where our heddles are and the breast beam. And then so we want to be able to have enough room to move around and do that. So what we do is we give ourselves, I usually go to the back beam with my length, and I let it hang on the castle here. And then I come around to the front, and if I need to unchain to reach the breast beam, I do. So I'm going to unchain 2 of my things today. And then all you have to do is just wrap around the breast beam a couple of times with your warp. I always do 3 times, and then you can let me unchain a little more. And so then you can test the tension. You see that's like actually pretty good. So that'll be really easy to start working with. And then I just toss this one over the beater just because I know I'll be working on it soon. So I'm going to do it with my other color. And then that's it for today. Our next steps will be securing the beater in place so it doesn't move, and we'll start slaying our reed next. We're getting closer. Okay, we did it for today. We've made it. We're ready to start dressing the loom now. So again, our next steps will be to slay our reed, thread our heddles, attach to the back beam, and then start to warp everything, warp the loom, get our threads all through everything, tie onto the front, and then finally we're going to weave a header and actually start weaving our project. So stay tuned, we'll get to work on that, and then we'll be doing the plain weave and the twill for our first project. So congratulations for making this far. I know it's frustrating, but it's also really fun, and then you get to walk around wearing a scarf that you wove, and that's pretty exciting. Okay, thanks so much.